Good morning, and welcome to what I think may be our first Monday morning talk in the Contemporary History Institute speaker series, at least in a decade. In fact, I can attest to it being the first in a decade. I wonder if that's true for the entire 30-some years of the Institute. It's nice to see some new faces and some familiar faces in the audience. Before introducing Professor John McNeill, I'd like to thank our co-sponsors for today's talk. In fact, this all kind of came together as a co-production between the two Jeffs and myself, Jeff Buckley, Jeff DeBelco, and we're all Maryland PhDs as it happens. So I'm going to assure you that even though John McNeill, who has a Duke PhD, appears with a black eye, and it is basketball related, it has absolutely nothing to do with myself, or I assume either of the Jeffs. I'd like to thank Environmental Studies, Geography, and the Honors Tutorial College, the Sustainability Theme, and the Kennedy Lecture Series Grants Program. And for us, this is a pretty long list of co-sponsors, and maybe that's already an indication that John McNeill isn't the kind of historian who only appeals to other historians. He earned his MA and PhD in history from Duke University, and he's taught world, environmental, and international history at Georgetown University since the mid-1980s. Professor McNeill led the American Society for Environmental History a few years ago, and he's currently 4 months into his term as president of the American Historical Association. He has published widely, which is an understatement, in the fields of environmental and world history, and he's, in fact, one of the first historians to really link these fields in the innovative ways that he does. I'll spare us the detailed rundown of his roughly 140 journal articles and book chapters. I'll just say that would tenure a cohort of historians, I suspect. Or even of the 14 books and journal special issues that he's edited. Let's just say that's also a lot. But I think it's kind of a truism that historians are defined by their single-authored or sometimes co-authored books. And there he has 6 to his name, including in 2016, The Great Acceleration, an environmental history of the Anthropocene since 1945, co-authored with Peter Engelke. Maybe 2 books I found most enlightening, The Human Web, A Bird's Eye View of World History, which appeared some 15 years ago, co-authored with William H. McNeill, who happens to be a pioneering world historian and John McNeill's father, and as McNeill the Younger told us over dinner yesterday, this was to some extent to the detriment of short-term peace in the family, and Mosquito Empires in 2010, in which he shows that vector-borne diseases, especially yellow fever and malaria, actually explain much of the initial success and the longevity of the Spanish Empire in the Caribbean. For his work, John McNeill has won numerous prizes and fellowships, including 2 Fulbright Awards, a Guggenheim Fellowship, a MacArthur Grant, a fellowship at the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars, and the 2018 Heineken Prize for History, which is a biennial prize awarded by the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences, given to, from their own definition, internationally renowned historians whose research still holds considerable promise for future innovative discoveries. This morning, Professor McNeill will speak about his new project in a talk entitled Elephant, Tusk, and Bison Hide, the Global Environment and the Industrial Revolution. We should have ample time for Q&A after the prepared remarks as well. So please join me in welcoming John McNeill to Athens and to Ohio University.
Well, thank you, Ingo, for that gracious introduction, and thank you to the 2 Jeffs for collaborating in the invitation to Ohio University. I'm very pleased to be here. Triply pleased to be invited by 3 Maryland PhDs. That's certainly never happened to me before, probably will never happen to me again. And yes, I do want to absolve them from responsibility for my black eye. It was instead of one of my own Georgetown colleagues who inflicted that on me, as you might guess, someone from the business school. So, yes, Ingo also mentioned that I had co-authored a book with my father. I learned last night that Jeff DeBelko co-authored long ago some work with his father. They seem to be on good terms with one another. I'm delighted to see that. But if any of you are considering co-authoring something with a close relative, I recommend that you come see me first. I can save you some family counseling fees. It's usually not a good idea. The DeBelkos are an exception to the rule. So, here's what I propose to do this morning. I'm going to explain a little bit about what I hope will be my next scholarly book after I finish my term as president of the American Historical Association, which is very interesting but completely overwhelms any prospects I have for scholarship. But that will end, and I'll get back to writing books. And this will be the book that I do next. So I'll explain a little bit about my aims in this book, a little bit about why I'm doing it. I'll try to explain what I think is the central concept, ecological teleconnections. I'll give a few examples, I hope not too many. And then I'll start talking about the problems I'm having, the issues that remain unresolved. There are quite a few of those. In effect, I am, as I write here, inviting you into my kitchen to see how I make a book happen. You know, the German Chancellor Bismarck was famous for many things. One of the things he was famous for is saying that laws are like sausages. They may be good, they may be bad, but under no circumstances do you want to see how they are made. Books are different. It's not a gory process. It's sometimes an enlightening process to see how books are made. So I'm going to explain a little bit about the travails and issues that I still need to grapple with. And I hope for those of you who haven't yet written books that this will be interesting and enlightening. So here is the general overall plan of what I have in mind. Part one is not that interesting to me. It's something that a fair number of environmental historians have already grappled with reasonably successfully, and I don't have any different or new ideas to offer about the local, mainly pollution effects of industrialization in the lands of industrialization themselves. It's part two that I'm really interested in, the ecological teleconnections around the world. And as you can see here, I intend to take on a few fibers, ores, lubricants, and a few miscellaneous items. And then part three, I'm not sure if I really should do part three, but book acquisitions editors and the marketing department and publishing houses really like it if the book somehow comes up to the present. So they will want me to write part three. And so maybe I will. In any case, the phenomenon that I'll be delineating this morning is one that has not vanished from the face of the earth, but it has changed its geography and its format somewhat. And part three would recognize that. So, let me get into the aims. As you can see here, they are two. I want to convince my fellow historians and everybody else who might be interested in industrialization and specifically the 19th century Industrial Revolution that the phenomenon should be understood not merely as an economic and social transformation, which it was, but additionally and fundamentally and equally importantly as an ecological transformation. And my second ambition is to convince anybody who might read this book that they should understand the Industrial Revolution as a global phenomenon from its genesis. It is typically understood as initially an English phenomenon that somehow spread to the European continent, to Eastern North America, eventually to Russia and Japan. And I don't dispute that understanding, but I want to flesh out that understanding by recognizing more fully what I call ingredients of industrialization. That is, the fibers, the ores, the lubricants, many of which came from far afield. And that's why I think it should be understood as a global phenomenon from the outset. So, why am I doing this? Probably many reasons, some of which I'm not aware of, but one of them that I am aware of is this lengthy quotation from the British economist William Jevons in 1865 in a book that is not much read anymore, but for reasons I can no longer recall, I did at least read parts of it, and I came across this explanation of what coal allowed Great Britain in the middle of the 19th century. All these commodities from all over the world that appear inside this quotation. And Jevons' words, in some respects, are mirrored by this map prepared by the godfather of infographics, the French military engineer named Charles Minard. You have probably seen at some point a graph he made of Napoleon's army going into Russia in 1812, and the band that represents the size of the army gets thinner and thinner, and then coming back out of Russia, it gets really thin. It's a brilliant piece of graphic representation of information. Somebody has called it the best ever such graphic. I'm not sure how one estimates these things, but at any rate, Charles Minard also drew this map of the coal exports of Britain in 1864. And it was these exports that allowed the imports that Jevons is writing about in this passage. So when I read this, I thought, well, that's interesting. What else was coming into Britain that combined with the coal to make industrialization what it was? And so since then, I've been on the hunt for those kinds of things, the things I call ingredients. Here's another inspiration. I read this book, The Destruction of the Bison by Andrew Eisenberg. There's one sentence in there in which he explains that among the several reasons why the North American bison population declined from several tens of millions in 1830 to 500 animals in 1881, the foremost of those reasons was that bison leather made the best belting for textile mills and factories. That is, for imparting power from a source, whether that's a water wheel or a steam engine, to a machine, a power loom. I've got a picture of them somewhere. There's an example in the middle there. Of course, there are other reasons why bison were shot, but this, according to Eisenberg, was the principal one. I thought, oh, that's interesting. A huge change to the biota of the North American Great Plains, inspired by the need for a component of industrialization. And the bison are important because They're a keystone species. They regulate the vegetation wherever they live. If you take them out of the equation, you're not merely eliminating bison, you're changing habitat for every other kind of creature on the Great Plains. So that was interesting to me. What else might go into industrialization that would have repercussions around the world? So that's my second inspiration. It's why I've been on the hunt for so long. Now, I'm going to dispense with the part one very quickly, but I do operate on the principle that one should never pass up an opportunity to quote Dickens, so I will. This is his rendition of air pollution in London in the middle of the 19th century. Vivid as Dickens always was. Smoke lowering down from chimney pots, making a soft black drizzle with flakes of soot in it as big as full-grown snowflakes. Gone into mourning, one might imagine, for the death of the sun. So I'm going to write something about these pollution effects, but I'm not going to talk about them today, and I will not make them the centerpiece of my environmental history of the Industrial Revolution, which everyone who has tried to write environmental histories of parts of the Industrial Revolution has done. So I'm going to do that differently. Instead, I'm going to try to coin a phrase, ecological teleconnections, stealing a term, teleconnection, from climate science and atmospheric science. It refers to the fact that disturbances in the atmosphere in one place can generate disturbances thousands of miles away through the complex physics of the motion of air masses. So that's a teleconnection. An ecological teleconnection, nobody uses that term except for me, and many of my good friends have told me I should not use it. It's either too complicated or too misleading. You might tell me the same thing. And I might, if everybody tells me the same thing, I might start believing them. At any rate, ecological teleconnections on some level have existed for a very long time in world history, but with cheap energy, fossil fuel energy in the 19th century, they became more routine. A larger variety of them came into existence, and the intensity of those that already existed increased. So I don't mean to argue that these kinds of linkages are brand new with industrialization, just that they are more numerous and more intense as a result of heightened demand for certain kinds of products from the natural world and cheap energy. Cheap energy being relevant by lowering transportation costs and by lowering production costs in textile mills and the metallurgical industry and almost every industry. Here's my first example, cotton. So, a number of things went into 19th century cotton mills, including cotton itself, and you can see where most of it came from, especially before the American Civil War and after the end of the American Civil War. Other places it came from were India, Egypt, eventually Russian Central Asia, and a few other locations, eventually China included. And as you know, it was often, as in the American South before the Civil War, produced with forced labor. But other things went into it as well, the iron ore of the machinery, and, as I've already tried to explain, belting, most of which came until the 1880s from bison hide. And I haven't explained why bison hide is a little bit better than cowhide as belting. The reason is it's a little bit stretchier, spongier, so that if there's some bouncing or jiggling in the machinery, the belting can continue doing its job. It's not going to snap. It's not going to fail. So that's one ingredient of industrialization I expect to write about, probably focusing mainly on the American South, Egypt, and India, trying to explain the ecological ramifications of turning vast tracts over to cotton production. And in some cases, as in most of India and in Egypt, irrigated cotton production with all of the attendant consequences of an intensive irrigation regime, such as salinization. Then I'm going to turn to wool. Now, a lot of the wool in the woolens industry, especially in the early decades of industrialization in Britain, came from nearby, came from the British Isles or even continental Europe. But by the middle of the 19th century, a lot of it came from 12,000 miles away, from New Zealand, Australia, Argentina. And I'm probably going to focus on New Zealand, maybe Australia as well. And New Zealand is one of the last places on Earth to acquire human population. There were no humans there until about 1250. And these maps give you some indication of the history of vegetation change on the islands of New Zealand, which were substantially forested, mainly with a temperate rainforest until 1250. Moderate deforestation took place in the roughly 500 years in which the indigenous population, the Maori, in a sense they're indigenous because they got there first, and they deforested New Zealand to some extent, but the accelerated deforestation really began around 1850, and the main driver was converting forest land into pasture land for wool production. And the most dramatic examples of this came in the Canterbury Plain around Christchurch, a city that's been in the news for bad reasons recently. Absolutely beautiful country, fully forested in 1800. Scarcely a tree to be seen now. So that's a significant environmental transformation. The grasses there are imported grasses. They're not native to New Zealand. And of course, the sheep are also imported species. So the machines that produced all the industrial items had to be kept running, and they required lubricants. In the early years of industrialization, many different kinds of lubricants were used, including palm oil, which we know is a food additive, but until 1920 it was mainly a machine lubricant, and including whale oil, which historians typically think of as an illuminant, which it was, but it was also a machine lubricant, especially where high temperatures were involved. In fact, as those of you who have read Friedrich's practical treatise on friction, lubrication, fats, and oils from 1916 will recall, until the early 20th century, it was the best high-temperature lubricant available. And whale oil was still used, as you can read here, in some applications as a lubricant until 1973. So part of the reason, by no means the only reason, that a massive oceanic whale hunt for right whales and sperm whales took place in the 19th century, radically reducing whale populations, although we don't really know by how much. They're hard to count. A big reason why this took place is to lubricate the machines in Britain, in Eastern North America, and other lands of industrialization, until petroleum derivatives began to drive whale oil's market share down. I don't really know to what extent those whales can be considered a keystone species like the bison on the North American grasslands. If you take whales out of the ocean, what knock-on effects follow from that? I need to find that out. Could be that they're not any significant ones. Could be that they are significant. And I'm sure it's not too hard to find out. Ores. I might do copper. I might do tin. I'm pretty sure I'm going to do lead. And going to emphasize one small region in the south of Spain, in the province of Almería, a certain mountain chain, the Sierra de Gádor. This, from about 1830 to 1870, was the world's most active lead mining zone, and most of the lead mined there went to Great Britain, where it ultimately found its way as an alloy into machinery and was used in piping and tiles, all sorts of applications. But in this little corner of Spain where the ore was mined, it was also smelted, and that meant enormous fuel demand in a comparatively dry, not terribly lush landscape. This is what it looks like today on the left. Those are pit props indicating one of the wood requirements of mining operations. And then in the small print here, you can see a handy quotation that I found not too long ago. And I'll read the English version of it in case there's some of you in the back whose eyes are as old as mine. The mining operations begun around 1820 resulted in the devastation of the vegetation cover of the Sierra de Gádor. The location of the small smelters depended on the supply of fuel wood, which was rapidly consumed by the smelter ovens. By 1835, the Adra region, that's the region drained by a teeny little river called the Adra, coming out of the Sierra. The Adra region was almost fully deforested and denuded of vegetation. So this is an indirect effect. It's mainly smelting rather than the mining per se that transformed the landscape of this particular Sierra. Here you can see some of the smelting furnaces that still exist in those mountains. And another quotation that says almost exactly the same thing. One of the interesting results of this was a dramatic change in the coastline of southern Spain. In the years when the vegetation cover was removed, the rate of erosion and deposition of soils from the mountains skyrocketed. So much so that this little river, the Adra, which used to push enough silt out into the Mediterranean Sea to expand Spain southward by about 6 centimeters per year, and had done so since 4000 BC. In the 19th century, it started pushing Spain out into the Mediterranean at a rate of 16 meters per year, a few hundred times as fast as it had done over the previous 5,000 years. And you can see here a map that shows a new delta. The old delta, it appears here as delta inactivo on the left. Kind of small. And then the new delta is that big one in the center of this map. And that big new delta is a result, indirectly, of the mining operations in the mountains up above this coastline. In fact, the coastline was moving so fast in the 19th century that alert speculators would buy, and the alert Spanish state would sell land that didn't exist. It would sell patches of Mediterranean Sea, knowing that it would become land within a matter of years. It's the only example I've ever encountered of a real estate speculation market for land that didn't exist. But everybody knew it would come into existence. So here's what the landscape looks like in more recent times. In a 1927 aerial photograph on the upper right, a more recent aerial photograph in the lower right. And as I write here, the mountain soils are put to work. They grow vegetables and hothouse flowers for the Northern European market. It's still a really poor, probably the poorest part of Spain, which it was in the 19th century as well. Another example. So, industrialization required lots of leather, not just for belting, but for a million other purposes. And of course, some final products were created out of leather. To make leather pliable and attractive, it needed tanning with tanning dyes. And in the late 19th century, the best tanning dye in the world came from the heartwood of a tree that grew in Argentina and Bolivia and Paraguay, the so-called popular name, the quebracho tree. Very hard wood, so hard, dense, it doesn't float. And from 1867 forward, its tanning properties were known and utilized. In the 1890s, partly because of railroad connections that made it easier to get these logs out of the interior of South America and to the port of Buenos Aires, the production of quebracho and the cutting of the trees accelerated dramatically. And you can see in the bottom right some tiny print. These are export numbers to the European market, mainly to Hamburg. I'll just read you the low and the high. 1892, 29,000 tons. 1895, 154,000 tons. That's a five-fold increase in the first half of the 1890s. Until about 1940, this was the best leather dye in the world. Then chemical dyes replaced it. But in the years between 1867 and 1940, about 10 million hectares of Argentinian forest were cut in order to provide this dye to leather manufacturers in Hamburg and in Brooklyn, above all other destinations. That was a significant proportion of Argentina's forests. And it's one of those situations where you have to kill the tree to get the product you want, unlike, say, rubber tapping, where the tree can survive, or maple syrup production. Here's my favorite example. So in the state of Connecticut, there is a community on the Connecticut River called Essex. It used to be called Ivoryton, because it used to be the world's center of piano keyboard manufacture. And in the 19th century, every middle-class household wanted to have a parlor and a piano. It was a signifier of respectability and culture and refinement. And millions of piano keyboards were produced in the United States to be sold not only in the United States, but elsewhere around the world. Keyboards were produced also in Europe, but the U.S. actually exported significant numbers of keyboards to European markets in the 19th century. Okay, because Ivoryton was actually more sophisticated mechanically, producing better quality keyboards cheaper. And they needed ivory for this. And they needed East African elephant ivory, which is more lustrous than other kinds of elephant ivory and easier to work, to slice it very fine, because the ivory was used as a laminate on top of wooden keys. It's not that piano keys are made out of solid ivory. So you can see some of the numbers here about how many tusks, how many elephants, etc., were required to keep the factories of Ivoryton going. My estimate is that the biggest company, and I only have the production data for one company in Ivoryton, there are several companies, took about 1,000 elephants a year to keep one big company going in the 19th century. And in the late 19th century, 1870 to 1900, somewhere between 100,000 and 150,000 elephants were killed in order to get ivory for the piano production process in Connecticut. That's not a whole lot of elephants over 30 years, 100 to 150,000, but Ivoryton was only part of the world's ivory manufacturing business. There were others elsewhere in Connecticut and others elsewhere in the world. Part of the reason this is my favorite example is because some of the evidence for it comes in a very unusual format, which is the work of chemists. This map shows the location of elephants whose tusks were made into ivory that found its way into museums and has reasonably secure dates associated with those museum pieces. A handful of chemists a few years ago took a few hundred of these museum pieces and performed analysis of isotopic ratios of carbon, nitrogen, and strontium, which allowed them to make inferences, I believe strong and reliable inferences, about where the elephant whose ivory was being analyzed had grown up. Because the vegetation that elephant ate, and the elephant turned that vegetation into ivory, has chemical signatures of the soils in which it grew. So it is possible, by looking at museum pieces from around the world with dates on them, to map an elephant hunting frontier in East Africa. Now, the little elephant icons unfortunately don't have dates on them, but if they did, they would show you that the elephant hunting progressed westward and northward from the coastline. And this is demonstrable through the chemical analysis of museum ivory. It confirms what some historians have previously said about the ivory frontier in East Africa. Elephants, in a way, are like bison. They regulate the vegetation of the grasslands in East Africa, where they live on the savannas. Elephants elsewhere in Africa live in different kinds of habitats. But in East Africa, they're mainly on savanna grasslands. They regulate the vegetation of those grasslands in analogous ways to the way the bison regulated the vegetation of the North American prairies. Another keystone species, and therefore knock-on consequences, indirect consequences of radical reductions of elephant populations in the 19th century. Now, I should say that not all elephant slaughter was motivated by producing piano keyboards, other ivory objects, mainly billiard balls and combs, and there was always an a market for East African elephant ivory in India for jewelry, bangles, and so forth. So that's my last example. Now, I'm going to explain some of the difficulties that I face. First, the roster of ingredients. Do I have the right ones? I could add a few other things. So I mentioned here iron, rubber, wood. Iron and wood were really important. They were mainly locally sourced, so they're not really teleconnections. I'm going to have to acknowledge their significance. I don't want to say much about them, however. Rubber becomes important by the 1890s. That fits. Teleconnection, not a whole lot of ecological transformation, however, as a result of rubber production. Guano, peanut oil as a lubricant. Some people, India historians, told me I need to include indigo and jute. And I've learned a little bit about jute production, which did have significant ecological consequences. Jute was a fiber that was used mainly in making bags, sacking, not only in India, but also in Scotland. The world center of jute burlap manufacture was Dundee in Scotland. I'm tempted to include jute. And gutta percha, which comes from a tree, it was used mainly as insulation, especially for undersea applications because it doesn't corrode in salt water, for telegraph, undersea telegraph cables. And millions of Isonandra trees were cut in order to manufacture lots of gutta percha between 1870 and 1920. I'm tempted to include that. Some people tell me I ought to include foodstuffs. How can you have industrialization without a labor force that eats? And so the grain frontiers of the 19th century belong in my story. I haven't made up my mind. But those grain frontiers, North America, Argentina, Russia, historians have a pretty good grasp of that subject already. Would I be adding anything? Maybe looking at them from a slightly different angle? I don't know. I'm tempted to leave that out. Here's another problem. I've spoken this morning mainly about industrialization in Britain and to a small extent in the eastern USA. Should I stop there? 19th century industrialization also took place in Belgium, Germany, to a lesser extent elsewhere in Western Europe, and by the end of the 19th century in Russia and Japan. Did they have ecological teleconnections? Probably they did. Do I want to include that? It would make it more global. It would make it more responsible in a sense that it would correspond better with 19th century reality. But I can't do research in Russian and Japanese. I'm not going to learn Russian or Japanese anytime soon. So I would be obliged to do my research on the basis of things that are in languages I can read. It would create an asymmetrical research effort behind the book. It's not fatal. I've done it before, but I'm a little bit uncomfortable with that. Maybe it's enough to establish the idea, the phenomenon, based on the example of the British Isles in eastern North America. Again, I haven't made up my mind. I've already talked a little bit about whether Part 3 belongs, the modern, post-1980 version of this phenomenon, centered around the industrialization of East Asia, China in particular. If I do that, it will be short, it will be a coda, it won't be based really on much research. I'm tempted to include that. Here's another problem. Do I have the right organization scheme? I showed you an outline, and I'll show it to you again as I close. Essentially organizing this ingredient by ingredient, each one getting a chapter or maybe two stuffed into one chapter. There are other ways this could be done. Historians usually like to organize things chronologically. Maybe I should do that. Or maybe I should do it geographically. Or maybe I should do it by biome. Grasslands, forests, oceans, etc. At the moment, I don't think so. At the moment, I think the coherence of the stories around each ingredient makes for a stronger principle of organization, but I'm trying to keep an open mind about that. Then, here's where I really lay some cards on the table. I'm going to end this sometime in the early 20th century. And the reason I'm going to do that is because I've already written a global environmental history of the 20th century, and I don't have much new to say about that subject. So I'm going to stop in the early 20th century. I'm on the hunt for an intellectually legitimate rationale for doing what I'm going to do. And here's some ideas. So I could argue that the rise of chemical engineering changes the equation sufficiently so that ingredients for industrialization no longer come so directly from the natural world as they did in the 19th century. And more of them are the product of the ingenuity of chemical engineers using petroleum as a feedstock, petroleum and a few other things. In which case, I would be arguing that the phenomenon I'm drawing attention to faded out in the course of the 20th century. That's one possible argument. And what it does essentially is highlight the rise of oil as a game-changing entry into the equation. I could instead argue what is almost the opposite of that, which is that this pattern of ecological teleconnection driven by the necessity of ramping up production of ingredients for industrialization continued and continues to this day, justifying that Part 3 quota. But that the basic pattern was in place by 1900 or 1920. And that my book is about the establishment and creation, crystallization, consolidation of this pattern, rather than about the entire history of the phenomenon. If I'm arguing that, it's basically the reverse of the first proposition, that oil changed everything and the phenomenon was over by the early 20th century. So I can't argue both of these at the same time. Although I think F. Scott Fitzgerald said the mark of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to maintain two mutually exclusive propositions in one's mind at the same time. But I probably don't have a first-rate intelligence, so I'm not going to do that. Lastly, some more and larger scale lingering questions. So someone to whom I've tried to explain my ideas told me that I should expand my concept of ecological teleconnection, which is essentially spatial, so as to become also chronological. I must say that had never occurred to me, and I'm sure it never would have occurred to me. I can remember exactly who said this to me and where it happened. The best argument for doing this would be including discussion of things such as climate change and atmospheric chemistry, and how the early decades of industrialization involved the emission of carbon, some of which remains in the atmosphere 150, 180 years later. There is therefore a chronological teleconnection between early industrialization and environmental change in the 21st century. I am tempted to do that. Not that I would be saying anything new about the history of the atmosphere or climate change. I would merely be linking that in a conceptual fashion that would broaden the meaning of the work that I'm doing. And then lots of people tell me, if I write this book, I need to frame it in terms of colonialism, or frame it in terms of capitalism, or perhaps some other major themes, preoccupations of global historians working on the 19th century. I'm tempted not to do this. Although, if I don't, I will receive a few brickbats in book reviews. But at this stage of my life, it doesn't matter all that much. The reason I'm tempted not to do it is because I want to focus attention precisely on this phenomenon, as I see it, of ecological teleconnection, in order to highlight the global nature and the ecological nature of the Industrial Revolution. If I frame it in terms of capitalism or colonialism, I'm doing something that is a bit more conventional and routine, and therefore, I think, drawing attention away from the specific arguments that I want to put on the table for the enjoyment of my fellow historians and all readers. It's a bit of a problem. It's what I intend to write about is intimately woven together with the story of capitalism and the story of colonialism. And of course, it's easy enough to acknowledge that. But highlighting that, framing the book in those terms, I'm tempted not to do that. Okay, here's the end. So my grandmother, who was born in 1890 on Vancouver Island in a lumber camp that was in business precisely to feed the maw of industrialization. She, very unusually for girls in British Columbia in those days, insisted that she would get an education. She was the eldest of 12 children. Her parents had counted on her to help raise the other 11. She wanted to study literature, and she did. And she memorized reams of Victorian and Edwardian poetry, and when I was a boy, she used to recite it all from memory to me. I hated it. But I wish she could do it nowadays. I would enjoy it. So one of her favorite poems was this one by the poet laureate of the United Kingdom, then John Masefield, who wrote what I think is the last non-ironic poem about commerce. And in his last stanza of this poem, Cargoes, he wrote, and I'll try to imitate my grandmother's diction and inflection here. Dirty British coaster with a salt cake smokestack butting through the channel in the mad March days, with a cargo of tine coal, road rails, pig lead, firewood, ironware, and cheap tin trays. So I didn't like it when I was a kid, but I liked the rhythm of it, the meter of it. But John Masefield, whether or not he was a great poet, was not a great student of economic history. So I revised the end of the last stanza here to do better justice to the global nature of British industrialization. John Masefield had a rather provincial understanding. Of course, it probably scans better in his version, but the historically more sophisticated poem would end this way. With a cargo of tine coal, whale oil, Spain's lead, bison hide, kiwi wool, Malay tin trays. Thanks very much for your patience. And in our remaining minutes, I will do my best to answer, deflect any questions, quarrels, quibbles, or queries. Thanks again. Since you probably know the names of several of the people here, why don't you do it?
All right, well, you know his name. We'll go with Jeff.
More a comment, then I'm going to run and get our car. I'd written down, I was just sort of thinking of questions and comments and so on, and you had mentioned the foodstuffs. And I was thinking along the lines, it would be really neat to have sort of a modern Menard version of labor movements for some of these things. So I was just reading the other day about Spanish workers going to work in the pits in South Wales, and just how this was a relatively unpopulated area, and the ecological impact of having this labor force and feeding this labor force over a very short period of time, it skyrockets, and how you support that. So I don't think that rises to the level of chapter significance necessarily, but I think that's a really interesting point to include in there, the movements of people, in some cases pretty far, to extract these resources, because they're moving into areas that are relatively unpopulated. The ecological impact obviously is great.
You read my mind. Thank you. So one of the virtues of giving talks about works that aren't very far along is that I absorb suggestions. You heard me mention a few of the suggestions. Right, got to stay behind the microphone. Sorry about that. Yeah, so one of the virtues of taking the show on the road prematurely is getting suggestions. And you heard me mention a few of those that have changed my thinking along the way. That's why I have to borrow this and scribble down a few notes. So thank you, Jeff. If Charles Minard were alive, I'd be delighted to get him to draw such an infographic for me. Maybe there are other people who could do it too.
One of the things I found striking about your conception of ecological telecommunications is that it's the keystone species that really seem to stand out within that concept. And so I was wondering if that's what distinguishes it from other narratives of industrialization and resulting ecological degradation, is the focus on biological species. And if that's the case, how do you think about this differently from other historians who have focused on industrialization and living organisms, like Philip Scranton's book, Industrialized Organisms, or Edmund Russell's book, Evolutionary History, which might be why you get all these questions about why not food if you're going to focus on animals and whales and trees.
I'm going to focus on animals, whales, and trees, but also on lead and tin. So it's not only the biological world, it's about half the biological world. And the ways in which I might differ a little bit from some of these other authors, Ed Russell, Philip Scranton, is that my main interests, I'd say there are two differences. One is the requirement for me of teleconnections. So if things are locally sourced, they're not so interesting to me. And that's not the case for Scranton and Russell. That's not a consideration. Local, distant, doesn't matter as far as they're concerned. For me, because I'm preoccupied with portraying the industrialization process as global from the outset, I have this bias in favor of the teleconnection, not just the connection. That's one difference. The second difference is that I'm more focused on the ecological consequences of ramping up production of bison hide or quebracho dye or lead. And that's not the case for Ed Russell. He's interested in how it was that long staple cotton had evolved under human hand so as to be well suited to machine cotton production. It's really interesting. And I'm a great admirer of that piece of work of his. But he's not interested in the ecological consequences of cotton production spreading all over the world. That is what I'm interested in. I'm ultimately portraying industrialization as disruptive to ecosystems in South America, Africa, Australia, South Asia, etc. That's not something that Russell or Scranton or anybody else that I'm aware of is interested in. And the commodity historians, let's say Sven Beckert, who wrote a big fat book about cotton, mainly 19th century cotton, they're not interested in the ecological implications of cotton production either. They should be.
There's our cotton historian, Reggie O'Brien.
Not a question about cotton. With your ending and the why 1920, I guess I'm not an expert on that area at all, but it strikes me that why can't you hold both of those things to be the case? Because it does seem as if oil, based on the commodities you talked about, and petroleum, broadly speaking, the different byproducts of it, are a game changer in certain ways of making the economy less connected to certain aspects of nature, right? Even as there may be other ways in which the economy, industrialism does remain dependent on some products in nature. So I guess I have full confidence that you have F. Scott Fitzgerald's requirement for this, a first-class mind to do it. It just strikes me that that seems to be the most accurate answer based on the story you told.
I appreciate your confidence. And maybe you're right. Maybe I could argue that while oil is a game changer and puts certain teleconnections out of business, let's say palm oil as a lubricant disappears, it might actually sustain some other teleconnections or even conceivably bring new ones into existence in ways that I haven't contemplated. Of course, to the extent that I argue that, I'm asking myself to follow that story throughout the 20th century, which is what I'm trying to avoid. Maybe I can come up with a reasonably elegant way to argue both those things at the same time and still stop when I gotta stop. But I think you've made my life harder rather than easier with this suggestion. I'm going to write it down anyway, give it some thought, but at the moment, at least, maybe I need more than a first-rate intelligence to sort this one out. But thank you.
Well, with the 20th century, it's kind of difficult. How about the 21st century? I mean, in this century, we're seeing changes with internet, information. I mean, we know a bit of like Bitcoin mining is consuming electricity and that kind of stuff. But I'm just wondering, are there any analogies that you can draw with the current challenges that we're facing? The current kind of steps?
Yeah, I think there are, and this is why I'm tempted to do this coda featuring East Asian industrialization. So there are a lot of teleconnections in East Asian industrialization, including some of the more fundamental ingredients like coal, a lot of which comes from Australia in the case of China, for example. And all of those rare earth metals that go into our phones, some of them do come from China. A lot of them come from Africa and South America. There are certainly powerful mineral components to East Asian industrialization that involve ecological teleconnections, which are often highly disruptive, as mining ordinarily is highly disruptive in whatever landscapes it takes place. In the biological realm, I think it's less important, although there are still fibers that go into textile manufacture that are sourced from almost all over the world, that are relevant in at least ongoing Southeast Asian industrialization. So those are the kinds of things that I envision putting into my coda, which would begin about 1980, but would continue up to whenever it is I finish this book, which I'm afraid is going to be 20-something. So yes, there are going to be some contemporary examples.
Just to piggyback on that one, I do think part of where that discussion at the end of the current situation, this may be a small point, but one that I find somehow shocks people, is that with the imperative to have a green energy transition, that the Industrial Revolution and that period, which is ultimately fossil fuel based, is dirty, and the green energy revolution will somehow not have all these shadow ecologies, shadows of consumption, and all these links that you're teasing out and showing both in the mineral inputs as well as the biological. And so as a way to end, to suggest that there's going to be, the John McNeill 100 years from now is going to be able to tell a similar story for this new technological era that unfortunately I think many don't appreciate, that those windmills and solar panels have the mining legacy that you're talking about that goes into them. The palm oil, maybe the biological is not as obvious with a particular species, but now especially palm going into fuel is accelerating that deforestation and a loss of an ecosystem in tropical forests in particular, that is going to have some real biological loss, big ecological footprint. That means that these issues are not just history, but are present and will become a big part of a very interesting history. And so a continuum rather than a stopping may be a way to tell folks that this is a very current story.
Yeah, I'm sympathetic to that, even though you're raining on a lot of people's parades with that.
Not going to be a kumbaya moment.
Sympathetic to that, except I'm still going to skip over most of the 20th century in this project and sort of leapfrog into the coda and the 21st. But insofar as I abandon my instincts as a historian and write about history that hasn't yet happened, I'll be drawn into these kinds of issues. And I tend to agree that the next energy regime is going to have its own set of unwelcome ecological implications. Now, I actually believe they're going to be fewer and less serious than the fossil fuel-based energy regimes' ecological implications have been over the last 200 years. I certainly hope that's the case, but it's not going to be clean and zero, and the stresses will be applied in different ways and different places than what we have witnessed over the last 200 years, and it's important to recognize that. I am reminded in this of an article by the historian of China, Mark Elvin, who wrote a piece called 3,000 Years of Unsustainable Development about Chinese history. And his point was that at different intervals in Chinese history, ecological stresses were redefined and relocated so that an unsustainable regime ended and was replaced by another unsustainable regime. But the pressure points in that second unsustainable regime were different. He, if I remember correctly, this was published in 1994, and I haven't looked at it for a long time, posits 3 different unsustainable regimes piled one on top of each other in Chinese history. And then suggests that this arrangement is sustainable as long as the unsustainability is different every time. Now, maybe he's right for Chinese history. Would that mean he's right generally for global history? I would argue no. But these are the kinds of things that my study might illuminate a little bit. And I will probably be tempted, as I say, to abandon my instincts as a historian and to write about history that hasn't yet happened. Briefly.
So listening to your talk, it was reminiscent to me of nature's metropolis of a, expanded to a global scale. And what Cronin was trying to do there was, invert time and space, right? To sort of think in terms of center and periphery. And kind of use this Montunin's kind of concentric circles to do that. And I wondered, listening to your talk, whether what you thought in terms of center and periphery, or whether you see multiple centers. And either way, whether you had developed something of a mental map about how to relate regions, to a particular industrial core, whether that model is something that's useful or whether you're thinking in different terms.
It could be that Cronin's book about Chicago, Nature's Metropolis, is one of my inspirations that I'm not aware of, because I've taught the book many times. Here's how I think what is different about my mental map from the map that he drew of commodity production in the heartland of North America. His book is about livestock, grain, and timber, and how the city of Chicago organized the production of these throughout the Midwest from about 1850 to about 1900. First of all, I do see multiple centers, not just Manchester, but industrial zones in Britain, in Eastern North America, and as I said a few minutes ago, possibly beyond that, in Europe, in Japan. Secondly, the livestock, grain, and timber production that Cronin wrote about was spatially very widespread. Unlike the lead production in the Sierra de Gádor, which was just a few mines in a few square miles, or some of the other examples that I've got. Now, in the case of the bison or the elephants or the whales, they were spread out over broad regions, just like Cronin's commodities. But some of mine, like the quebracho dye, are very concentrated. They came from only one fairly small patch of the world. So the periphery, in my case, is in some cases an archipelago of small spots, quite unlike Cronin's cases, and in some cases fanned out over broad regions, just like Cronin's cases. But it might be worth, in an introduction, sketching out these distinctions. Because other people will, the same thing will occur to other people who have read that book, which is quite a lot of people in my field. In fact, everybody in my field. So it might be wise to do that. Normally, I try to minimize historiographical discussion, but there are occasions when it's warranted. This might be one.
Yeah, well, it's going to use it as a prompt for a question of the same kind, so I think.
So I'm going to butt into your conversation or memory with your grandmother, which is probably unwise, but in the Mansfield poem, you sort of represented as something as unironic, and in the first stanzas, he certainly romanticizes, memory. But I was really curious why you wanted to take out cheap tin trays, because he seems to be talking about a deeper environmental awareness and saying, is this degradation worth it? And so I was kind of curious why you took that out.
I changed it to Malay tin trays. I was trying to specify the place. Of course, a lot of tin came from Cornwall. But by the time Masefield was writing, a lot of tin was also coming from Malaya. So I wanted to tweak the tin tray reference so as to acknowledge the teleconnection. That's all I was.
And so one other question. I think teleconnection's a really good word, and I was wondering what your wise colleagues who advise you against it, what are their points?
Their objections are that it's already used in climate science to mean something else. And therefore, anybody with any familiarity with climate science will find it objectionable as it's being repurposed. I'm still tempted to do it. I have perhaps the vain ambition of creating a phrase that will live on. So in my field, environmental history, the late lamented Alfred Crosby wrote a book called The Columbian Exchange. And that phrase, Columbian Exchange, entered the lexicon not only of environmental historians, but a huge proportion of historians generally. It captured a set of processes tidily. And I'm thinking along the same lines. This may not be quite as catchy as Columbian Exchange, so maybe it could be improved upon. But I want a term that will encapsulate this set of connections and serve as instantaneous shorthand. That's why I'm tempted to use it, even if it is repurposing a term that already exists in the broad community of environmental science. I'm going to irritate people one way or another. I have to make my peace with that.
John, you can just tell them that they've done the same thing with resilience, right? So resilience is now being used in multiple sectors, and the climate people were not the first, but they are definitely enthusiastically embracing it as a climate resilient city or a smart city. So they are borrowing terms themselves. So it's a two-way street.
All right, they're at least as guilty as I am. Okay, I like that.
Let me maybe ask a last question, which I thought you might know too. It's more methods oriented and writing oriented, and since you've gone through this process a few times with a global lens, I'm kind of curious, at what point in the process do you commit to a kind of concept of what sort of book this is in terms of length and pitch, how narrative it is, how much like Becker's tome it is, or much more like the succinct, more concise works?
So, earlier in life, these decisions were easier for me because I knew more clearly what I hoped to achieve. Early in my career, I was trying to write books that would win the approval of a narrow population of professional colleagues, including people who might be voting on my tenure. Now, I don't worry about that so much, and it becomes an open question whether I should try to write this book, others as well, for as large a public as I can possibly attain. And if I did that, I would make the book comparatively brief, and I wouldn't bother spending years going to Argentina and New Zealand and India and hiding away in archives. I would do it on the basis of extant published literature, and I would select my ingredients not just for the degree to which their story illustrates the principle I'm trying to establish, but also for the ease with which I could write a chapter based on published materials. That's one approach, and it would allow me to complete this faster and probably reach more readers. At the other end of the continuum is the kind of book that makes the best impression on my professional colleagues. That would be a fatter book, dripping with footnotes from archives all over the world, and it would take me 3 or 4 times as long to do it. I haven't actually made up my mind, and it's possible to bridge the gap and either research all of these ingredients in archives but superficially, or do things asymmetrically, and in some instances do it in depth archivally. So in the case of southern Spain, I've already done some of the work, but in most of these cases I haven't. And I could do some in depth and others on the basis of published literature. That would look weird for most historians, but it would not be unprecedented. So there are a number of places I could ultimately occupy on this continuum that I've tried to sketch. Haven't fully made up my mind. Life is likely to make up my mind for me. That is, how much do I want to devote over the next several years to provincial towns in Argentina? Can I get my wife to go with me? If she refuses, I don't really want to go to northern Argentina for 3 or 4 or 5 months and research this case in detail. When I was 30, I would have said, I have to do that. And if my wife refuses to come, if my marriage explodes, well, my career requires it. I actually wouldn't have thought in those terms. I would have come up with a different project. But that's what I mean when I say life is going to decide it. I'm not prepared now to absorb the costs in terms of my personal existence that might be required. So a protracted negotiation with my wife is in my near future. And I'm going to show her beautiful pictures of northern Argentina and southern Spain and the Canterbury Plain in New Zealand. She's already seen that. And we'll see if I succeed. If not, I can do it, from the Library of Congress. It'll be a different kind of book. Life gets in the way sometimes, Ingo.